Minority Program. Unfortunately, today our director could not join us due to an personal emergency. So we'll be beginning. I will be the moderator and I'll also be joined by my colleague Shinvanti Mistry. And before I begin, I would just like to introduce the center to all of you. And then will proceed with the panel discussion. Center for Regional Research and Sustainability Studies is a global think tank which undertakes conceptual, empirical, and applied research with the motive to improve understanding of scientific and humanities-oriented issues and challenges. I would ask my colleague Shinvanti to take over, please.
Thank you, Srijani. It was a wonderful beginning. Before moving on with today's panel discussion, I would just like to get myself introduced. So I'm Srinvanti, and I'm currently the Associate for the Peace and Conflict Program at CRRSS. And now I would just like to take the wonderful opportunity of introducing our esteemed panelists for the discussion. So firstly, I would like to introduce Dr. Garima Dhabhai. She is the Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at Presidency University, Kolkata, India. And I would just like to request Dr. Dhabhai to please speak a few words. Ma'am, please, over to you.
Yeah, hi. So as Srinvanti has already said, I teach political science in Presidency University. And though I'm not really an expert in this particular area, but I have been teaching papers on gender over the last 3 years and women power and politics. These are some of the papers that I teach, but I have also worked on urban spaces in India. So I would try to bring some of these points together, related to abuse of women in political power, along with my own research on urban space in India in today's discussion. So I hope we have a fruitful discussion, and please, and I also would like to thank the organizers for having me here. Thank you.
Ma'am, it's an honor. Thank you for being a part of the panel.
So thank you so much, Dr. Dhabhai, for your kind words. Now I would like to introduce our next esteemed panelist, Dr. Heidi Riley. She is an adjunct research fellow and former assistant professor in international relations in the School of Politics and International Relations, University College Dublin, Ireland. It would be really kind of you, ma'am, if you could just speak a few words, please. Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be part of this panel. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion, and particularly perspectives from India and from Ireland. So delighted to be part of it. My primary work focuses around gender, peace and conflict, and I teach in the area of gender, peace and conflict, and also conflict studies more generally. A lot of my work is around women, peace and security agenda, but also specifically on masculinities within armed groups. So a lot of my work has been in this area, particularly in Nepal. So again, thank you very much for the introduction, and delighted to be part of it.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words. Now I will request my colleague Srijani to just take over from here and introduce the rest of our esteemed panelists for the day. Thank you.
I would like to introduce Dr. Mary Kondra. Dr. Condren has been teaching at the Center for Gender and Women Studies at the Trinity College, Dublin since 1994, specifically focusing on gender, representation, violence, myth, and the sacred. I would request you, ma'am, to speak a few words.
Thank you again for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be able to join you, and particularly since my good experience with Nandini Gupta, whom I hope you might meet or certainly be in touch with. I'm a theologian by profession, but I am blacklisted from theology schools because of my work, which is critical of the main theological divisions, as it were. So I work in the area of gender and violence, and I focus on that from the point of view of colonization, from the point of view of the symbolic, and also particularly psychoanalysis. Can we find, tools within psychoanalysis that help us to understand the existence of ongoing conflict? So they're the three areas. And I also am currently writing a book about a figure called Bridget, And she's a good example of a woman who was written out of history in many ways, or domesticated so that she would not be a threat to anybody. So I'm trying to recuperate her traditions and the role of women. Her abbesses, the people who succeeded her, were known as those who turned back the streams of war. In other words, they were peace weavers or peacemakers. So I'm very honored to be able to work on her at this point. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to introduce the last speaker, last but not the least speaker for today's evening, Dr. Shaman Tagda. Dr. Shaman Tagda is a professor of comparative literature and director of School of Cultural Texts and Records at Jadavpur University. He has written extensively on both 19th century literature translation, the relationship between the biological sciences and literature, environment, ecology, rural development, and education in books. Sir, I would request you to speak a few words.
Thank you very much for having me here. I suppose I represent the villainous gender and sex. Yeah, I also happen to look like an Old Testament prophet who've done more harm to the cause of women than probably any other group of men. As Joni so kindly mentioned, I've allegedly been a teacher for almost 30 years now. And I strongly suspect they didn't find anybody else to join this panel, which is why I'm here. I did, however, do some work many, many years ago, 25 years ago or so, at Cambridge in the UK, not across the pond, on Darwin, and discovered a lot of very fascinating things about women that science was speaking of at that time, especially in the personal correspondence of a lot of remarkable women of that time, most of whom are still not very well known. And I write fairly regularly, and I'm a card-carrying member of the Anti-Nationals. My name is on various government lists as somebody to be wary of, a matter of great pride for me. And that's it.
Thank you, sir, for such wonderful words. So I now open the panel for discussion. Srinvanti, if you could take over, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shrejani, and thank you, Dr. Das, for your kind words. Now, I would just like to put forward the very first question of today's panel discussion, and it goes as, in 2008, women accounted for only 18% of parliament members worldwide. Since then, various countries have adopted diverse reservation policies to increase the participation of women in politics. Does the panel believe that these policies have had an impact on women's involvement in politics globally? Over to the panel. Thank you.
Srinvanti, your voice.
I'm sorry, was I not audible?
Srinvanti, your voice is cutting.
No,
your screen is frozen.
I'm a very strong thinker.
I'm sorry, I think it was some technical thing on my part. Was I audible, or shall I repeat the question once again?
You were audible.
Yes, you were audible. I think the problem is on part of Srijani. She also got disconnected. So please go ahead.
Panel, please. Yeah.
Could I take this up first, or is?
Yes, please
do.
do.
We order to speak, or do we just respond to this?
You can just respond to this like that.
Yeah, so any of you could go ahead.
Yeah, anybody could go ahead.
Okay, so I would just like to, flag off a few points, and then maybe we can have further discussion on them. First is, as I understood your question correctly, that we are trying to say, if I could generalize, that does formal political participation of women and representation of women in legislative bodies, does that ensure let's say, assumption of political power by them, and does that ensure that there would be some semblance of, equity, gender equity in those contexts? Am I right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So
Yes, yes.
I would say, at least from the context where we are, which is in the context of India, what we see is a constant, slew of violent acts and violence against women, not only within the domestic space, but much more when they step out for work or leisure. It is as if women have no place in the public space after a particular time or even in particular spaces. It is in such a context that we also see it's not unusual to see that a small number of women are participating in politics. And so it's always a welcome step to have more women legislators. However, having said that, I must also add that it's not just formalizing women's participation in politics that would bring any amount of equity, because the discourse, the language of politics itself, to my mind, at least in the Indian context, and I'm sure even in many other contexts all over the world, we also saw this during election campaigns in the US when Trump won. And Hillary Clinton was, running against him, that a lot of misogyny and a lot of casual sexism seeps into the political discourse. And in India, we have seen this over a period of time in election campaigns, in media, and new forms of media, such as social media, where you have trolling of those women activists, young journalists, actresses who are trying to speak up against a particular regime or against the dominant ideas in society. So I think, first of all, formal political representation, even though is a welcome step, and in India, we have not even been able to achieve that. I mean, women's reservation bill has time and again been tabled in the parliament by various parties. I mean, I would say UPA had made 2 attempts in this regard. NDA has not yet made any attempt since it came to power, but it has just been tabled. It has not really been passed in the parliament. So that's, of course, telling us something about the mindset of society and mindset of the parliamentarians. But on the other hand, I must also add that formal space for politics and opening it up for women does not always change the discourse of politics, which remains very masculine. And to just add an example, and then I'll stop, which is, if you look at the way in which women represent themselves in politics in India, usually they are expected to wear traditional attire or saris, speak in a particular tone, speak in a particular way, are given titles which suggest a familiar or homely domain. So many women politicians would be called variously as Didi, Behenji, like sisters, or Amma, which was a title given to the chief minister of Tamil Nadu, a state in in southern part of India, Jayalalitha. So how, a lot of these women, to be able to legitimize their position in politics, have to assume familiar names, have to sort of extend their private roles or extend the domestic role that is prescribed to women in India into the public space. And most of these women are also single women, which is also an interesting point. Like, why do we see so many unmarried or single women politicians in India who assume power, who reach a particular level of power in politics in India? A lot of these women have also sort of to legitimize their position as unmarried single women, which itself is a taboo in Indian society. They have to then invoke natal familial connections like Didi and Behenji in order to legitimize their position. So that's one point. And the second point is that in the informal domain, a lot of politics in India also happens not through formal political party institutions, but also informally. Informal networks of communication underlay a lot of formal politics in India. And do women have access to these informal networks of communication? Do they have access to these mentor-mentee groups, which are many a times male-centric groups, Dadas and Didis, for instance, in the context of Bengal politics, especially the Dada culture in even student politics in Bengal is something that I have noticed a lot. And so these cultures, which develop around tea stalls and places, public spaces, which have been a domain of men, male bonhomie in Indian society. And if women don't have access to them, or rather, let me put it like this, equal access to them, would it mean that their political access, even to formal institutions, would reduce? Or would it mean that their access to formal political institutions will just be figurative, not really substantial, unless they have a say in this informal political network, or unless they have access to informal political networks? So I'll just stop here for now and hope to have a discussion on this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dhabhai, for your insightful words. I would now request the other three esteemed panelists if they could shed light on this very concept.
Shall I go next?
Yes, ma'am, you can go on.
Okay, yeah. So look, first of all, thank you very much for the previous input there, and I think that's a really important, some hugely important points that have been raised around the kind of masculinization of politics. But of course, there's often this assumption that when we for that to change, that we just have to sort of insert women into politics. Now, of course, this is hugely important. Women have to have access to politics for a variety of reasons. Firstly, to act as role models for aspiring other women candidates, and primarily in order to be able to represent 50% of the population, given that 50% of the population is made up of men. But at the same time, we also have to remember that not all women are the same, and women have a variety of different ideologies and different positionalities. So the idea that kind of women automatically will act on behalf of other women is problematic. And also we have to kind of be aware of this idea of essentializing women, that women are needed in politics only to kind of deal with women's issues. So this is problematic when we kind of look at it very much as a just, kind of just add women. We need to be looking much more at the culture itself. And I think that that's an issue that has been raised. But I might just address this, the issue of quotas or reservations, as you've mentioned in the question. So, how do quotas or reservations impact upon gender imbalances or shifting gender imbalances in politics? And I think there's a number of positives and negatives in relation to quotas. I would be, personally, I would be very supportive of quotas and reservations, because in an institution or an environment which has been predominantly male dominated or has a history of male dominance, in order to kind of create these channels, quotas act as a very good, important channel for women's voices to come into those spaces. However, there is also the other argument, which sees quotas as a kind of a way of women to get into politics without the correct merit. Now, this is not to say that women do go into politics through quotas without the correct merit, but it can have the impact of undervaluing women. And in some cases, as we know, and I know in India as well, with reservations, there is cases where maybe a prominent man has a woman put into a position of power as a proxy. But this is not to say that these are the only spaces that get filled by quotas. And actually, if we think about quotas more as a transition from what was a particularly male-dominated sphere, to actually use quotas in which as a way of shifting that imbalance and normalizing women in politics is particularly important. I just go back to this idea of being you put into a quota as a wife of a prominent individual. What again is problematic about this position is that there then becomes this assumption that any woman who goes into politics who has a powerful wife, a husband who's already in politics, means that her recognition of her value is often undermined in a sense. So if I take, for example, so the Nepalese constitution, which was passed in 2015, which includes quotas for 30% quotas for women at federal level, and also 40% at the provincial elections. So if we take, for example, the first Speaker of the House, Ansari Gartimaga, who was, as I say, the first woman Speaker of the House, she didn't get in through the quota system, but her husband is also a powerful minister as well. So she is a very powerful woman, very political, extremely experienced to be in that position. But she was often undermined by the fact that her husband was also a powerful minister. So we have to be careful that these kind of fears about quotas don't come in to actually prevent women who have the correct merit, who have the qualifications to be there, to be undermined by some of these fears that we have. But also, just before I'll pass on to the rest of the panel in a minute, but just as a point to raise is that when quotas are in place, we have to go back to this notion that not all women are the same. And I think it's particularly important when quotas are put in place that we take an intersectional approach to how they are properly implemented. That it's not only women from the higher caste or higher classes or from who are representative of the highly educated kind of privileged sector of society, but you have to get a diversity of women into those quotas. So having reservations or quotas that also include gender quotas, but also include diversity beyond that, is also particularly important. And just on a final point, I think that quotas, particularly when there's a situation of political change or after a time of crisis, for example, in post-conflict, quotas can be very important in re-establishing a new political system in post-conflict. And we've seen that in Rwanda, for example, where their representation of women is now one of the highest in the world, and both at the political level, but also in the judicial system as well. So these are particular times of transition. Quotas can be particularly important in shifting the dynamics of what has been previously the kind of traditional status quo of masculine politics. So I'll leave it there and pass on to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. It was brilliant. Now I would just like to request the two of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Condren and Dr. Das, to shed light on this if they would like to.
Okay, I'd be happy to go next. I approach the question of the abuse of women in power from two perspectives. One is colonization and the long-term effects of colonization, and the other is from the point of view of psychoanalysis. And there are many tactics of colonization, and they apply to both women and men, but I'm going to focus on the effects of women, the effects on women. So the first question is the invasion of territory. I'm taking this approach because both India and Ireland are both formerly colonized countries, and we all still, experience the effects of colonization. The invasion of territory. The first thing colonizers do, is to invade territory. They don't wipe out the people, but they make them dependent. They make them dependent on their worldview and on their ideologies. And so women's territory has also been invaded, but women experience a double or triple colonization, because not only the physical geographical territory has been invaded, but also our reproductive areas have also been invaded. So the first one is the invasion of territory. The second one is the gods are destroyed. And as I said, my perspective comes from being a theologian. And in particular, in my work on Bridget and on other mythologies, there's very, very clear evidence of how the mythologies were performed across the world, whether in old Europe or Indo-European or other countries, so that the gods that are presented, or the worldview, or the symbolic, the social symbolic capital, is predominantly serves the interests of men. Initially, for instance, in India, it would have been serving the interests of the British, but now particularly the symbolic system and the social capital available largely serves the interests of men who have become colonizers now in their own right. The third issue is labeling inferiors as innately defective. And of course, women in most mythologies and social systems are innately defective in relation to the dominant criteria which have been set out by those in power. You know, and again, as a theologian, there's a long history of this being recorded in the theological tracts. You know, women, in some of them, women were only born because the sperm was defective, or because the wind blew in the wrong direction when they were being conceived. There's a history of that kind of propaganda, which, you know, is bound to have an effect, or an ongoing effect in our time. The next one is controlling freedom of expression. And again, we are taught only to speak the colonizer's language. And that just doesn't just mean, you know, etymologies. It also means the language which is acceptable. And if you don't speak that language, if you speak a language, for instance, deriving from a lineal or a matrixial point of view, it's not understood. You may as well be speaking, you know, an utterly foreign language, because it's not acceptable within the dominant semantics and grammar that are established by the political order. And then, of course, you know, there's native wisdom and female intuition. You know, in a colonized situation, women, both women and men, learn to develop ways of getting around the system. Now, if, you know, in the case of women at this point, there's an innate distrust of what we call devious dominance, because, you know, men will know that, you know, women have ways of getting around the system, but then they are not trusted. They're not trusted sometimes either by women or of men. And that brings about a kind of devious dominance, you know, that women will exercise that doesn't always go down too well either. But one of the most important things then is divide and conquer. Because as you will know from your Indian experience, divide and conquer is one of the ways in which the colonized entity will take control. And they will set up what they call colonial servants, who serve the status quo, and who will act on behalf of the colonizers. Now, this comes particularly critical when it comes to women, because when a woman assumes power in that kind of post-colonial society, you know, on whose behalf is she acting? Is she acting on behalf of the colonizer, or is she acting on behalf of, you know, women of her own domain, or of her own class, or of her own economic system? In other words, there's a multiple set of reasons for not trusting women in power. And the final one I'll come to from the point of view of envy, which is a psychoanalytic one, which is, you know, a little complex to say very much about it here. But envy is not a moral issue. Envy is something that we probably all experience from, it's almost a constitutional issue. And men have different ways of being very envious of women while appropriating their power. So that, for instance, when they go to war, they'll talk about Mother Ireland and Britannia and Mother India and you name it. It's a way of trying to, you know, secure female legitimation for whatever they are doing. And at the same time, they are, you know, profoundly envious. And then when it comes to women, I often, you know, sat with some of my elderly aunts, you know, watching the news, and their main concern was not what the woman was saying, but what she was wearing. And this is a way of provoking, women sometimes are very envious of one another. But when some women get into power, they're actually displacing their own envy by provoking it in everybody else. And so that's why I think, you look like a woman, like you see a woman like Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and she is trusted. She's not abused for being a woman in power because she doesn't provoke that envy. She wears a different colored jacket every day and the same, black pants, as it were. And somebody said to her, why don't you, wear different clothes? And she says, because I came here to serve my people. I did not come to be a model. And so I think we need to take account of envy, of the whole phenomenon of envy and how it works at a political level in order to understand the abuse of women in power. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present my thoughts on the matter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Condren. It was very insightful. Now I would just like to request Dr. Das to conclude this particular question with his views. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, because I agree with everything that my previous speakers have said. And what I'm going to say is not based on my work in academics, but rather on the experience of about 36 years working in 3 rural areas of Bengal. And I remember in the early 90s, when the Panchayati Raj, the amendment was on the anvil, and some of you, I don't even know whether people here are old enough to remember those debates. But I was working in a rural university at that point, Vishwabharati in Shantiniketan, which is both rural and extremely elite at the same time. And there was a huge amount of debate as to whether this would actually do any good when you're reserving 33% of the seats for women in the panchayats, which eventually came to pass due to the 73rd Amendment of 92. So it's been 28 years now, and several states have actually extended that to 50%. Now, 3 things have emerged from the actual lived experience of having women representatives at the lowest level of electoral democracy in our country. I mean, these are my opinions. I don't speak as a political scientist, but as someone who's observed these 3 areas in the districts of Hooghly, Bardhaman, and Birbhum for the last 40 odd years, I think, and been working there for the last 36, 37 years, which is that things didn't quite turn out as people expected. It was widely rumored that only the wives and the daughters or the mistresses and girlfriends of politicians would be representing them, that they would have no voice of their own, that they would be parroting what the men wanted them to say, and so on and so forth. But that has changed to a considerable extent. I can talk of very simple things like back in the early 90s, if a woman agitator or somebody who had violated some law, rule, whatever, was going to be picked up, you very often didn't have any women policemen accompanying them. Now it's almost unheard of, at least in Bengal. I mean, there are parts of India where this still happens. The presence of female officers of the court in the district courts, subdivisional courts, and so on and so forth, is now taken for granted. And women across India, rural India, know that they have certain legal rights. And if these legal rights are not maintained, then they can't do things like take women away at night. I mean, as far as I know, and my knowledge is necessarily limited, arrests of women or the picking up of women at night has certainly decreased almost to the point of zero in Bengal. These are not very great victories. They should be there in any civilized country. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the 73rd Amendment has, if we examine it, had an overall positive impact on women. The second point that I'd like to make is something that Heidi said about the fact that women are not to be seen as a homogeneous group or as a monolithic block, which is that these intersections with class, caste, gender, region, and gender obviously, religion, these become very important. So if you are a Muslim woman who's an elected representative in area which is a large Muslim population, then you're expected to serve the interests not only of your gender and your party, but also of that particular religious grouping. This happens especially in reserved seats where scheduled caste or scheduled tribe women are elected. And I have spoken to some of them. In fact, some of them are quote unquote my friends because I've known them for many years. And they always say that we are faced with this dilemma: do we speak as women, or do we speak as, Dalits, or as a member of a particular caste or a member of a particular religious community? And so I think that although there has been, in a very broad sense, a great deal of good that has been done as a result of this 73rd Amendment, and it's been extended to 50% in several states now. There are also these other very problematic areas of these other things like caste, like religion, class. So a woman may be attacked not because she's a woman, but because she's a woman belonging to a particular caste. I know of one tribal woman who stood for election on a small grouping communist party thing, and she was questioned not because she was a woman, but she was allegedly a rat eater. Because she was a Santal, so they are allegedly, they're supposed to eat field mice. So in election rallies, some of which I attended, this is probably in the late 90s, I forget exactly when. So they would be her political opponent, who was also a woman, would say that, can you trust a woman who eats rats? And other men who would speak on her behalf would say, you can't trust them, they eat rats, and so on and so forth. So these are complex issues, but I will end by saying something I've said twice already, like the bellman and the hunting of the snuff. I think reservation for women has overall had a positive impact, at least in those little bits of rural Bengal that I do know. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Das, for such insightful words. I would like to ask a question from the thread that we are talking about at this moment, is specifically focusing on what Dr. Das and Dr. Condren had said, is that whenever we look at women who are in political leadership, we always emphasize on their personal traits, or on their skin color, or maybe the clothes that they are wearing, just like Dr. Condren had said. So, and when we look at the male counterpart, we always see that we are emphasizing on their policies, what they're bringing to the table, how much are they doing for the people that they are serving, instead of when we should be looking at a woman who has had to struggle a way lot to come to the position that she is today. So I would like to ask, what is the opinion of the panel on this? And anybody could go ahead. I mean, anybody in the panel could go ahead.
I'm happy to start, or if that's okay. Yes. I think it's hugely problematic. I mean, and it's very, very true. A woman speaks in the Parliament. It's televised. Social media is full of comments on her outfit, what she looks like. A man does the same. It's all about the politics, and this is this is global, and I think it very much it's exacerbated now through online media, through social media rather, the abuse that women politicians receive through Twitter, through Facebook, well particularly Twitter, is often focused on the appearance. And if I just go back to one thing that Mary had mentioned around Angela Merkel. So she dresses very, wearing similar suits or just very, in a way that I suppose represents what she seeks to achieve as a politician. I suppose in a sense to avoid those kinds of abuses, but actually this still attracts different types of abuse because she's associated with being a man, because that's what a man is supposed to do, and that is what a man is supposed to wear. Now, often it's context specific, and I think it was previously mentioned around women in politics in India having to wear traditional saris, which is very much associated with the home. So therefore, if somebody steps outside of that, the possible online abuse that you would get from that for trying to be like a man or trying to be different is hugely problematic. I was listening recently to this, I'm originally from Scotland, and one of the youngest Scottish National Party candidates, a girl called Mary Black, who is a fantastic politician. She was elected at age 21, and she always dresses in quite a masculine way. And the abuse that she gets for dressing in that way is hugely, she gets it all the time. And she was in the British Parliament recently talking about some of the language that is used against her, really vicious language that is aimed at her appearance, but also her class. She comes from a very, I suppose, quite a deprived part of Glasgow, and this is this intersection again with class and gender, which renders women subject to the abuse, which is also interrelated with how she looks. That she comes from a rough area, she looks like a rough woman, as she was described. So this, I think, it's hugely problematic, and the result is that it undervalues women's voice, because the concentration is not necessarily on what is actually coming out of a woman's mouth in terms of their political voice, but it's focused too much on that image of what you're supposed to look like as a woman, and also the sexualization of women. So I'll leave it there for now.
I'd like to say something maybe about that also, because traditionally women have been the object of what we call conspicuous consumption. In other words, men might earn lots and lots and lots of money, but it only actually matters if their wives could dress up in the latest Chanel and the watches and the jewelry and the rings and you name it. So, women become the markers of success, and which also, as I said, folks envy. But I watch game shows, quiz shows particularly, because that keeps my brain active. And I've noticed that on one of them, a particular one, a thing called The Chase, the women presenters, they wear the same clothes every single time. And I'm quite sure that they have maybe multiple versions of the same clothes. But because they come on with the same dress every single time, you don't have to think about what they're wearing. And there's a young woman, Katrina Perry, who used to be the Irish correspondent in Washington. She's now back in Ireland. She's presenting the news. She appears every single time in the same dress of a different color. And last night she had a beautiful one on in lemon. But I often watch her because she contrasts with another woman, and every time she comes on, she's just had her hair done. She's got a different outfit. And all you see, certainly for the first 5 minutes, is how did she do that with her hair, or where did she get that outfit, or, So I think it is an issue, and also if, like Mary Black, who, as Heidi has said, is a brilliant politician, if she's dressing like a man, then can we trust her? That's the other question that comes up. Is she going to act toward us as a man would act? And can she be trusted? Is she one of us? So I just think there's very little attention has been paid to how women dress in public life, and it's a hugely important issue. That's all I would say on that.
May I come in here?
Yes.
So I agree with the speakers who have rightly pointed out that, many a times there's a lot of public discourse that sort of comes up on what women are wearing, or we also have to analyze their sartorial choices in order to understand the contexts in which, they are part of politics. And I would say that, in the context of India, there's this dichotomy in the way, which is, I'm sure, everywhere too, in the way in which women are supposed to dress and men represent themselves in the public space. So with women politicians, what we see is a sort of desexualization and deglamorization to become legitimate in the public space, in the political domains. You know, saris of a similar style, many a times dull colored saris or dull colored outfits, so that they don't come across as very vibrant in the public domain, whereas male politicians, and I would refer to, you know, the Prime Minister currently, has over and over again sort of prided himself, and in some speech he said it, and it has been repeated in several you know, channels later on in media outlets, that how he has a 56-inch chest. So this physical attribute of men and a certain masculine militarized image of a male body is something which came across as, you know, where he would be seen as a protector of the nation, was counterpoised against women politicians who would be expected to dress in a way which would not bring them in the, you know, in the public eye, which would not sort of throw light on them in a way. So they would have to be subdued. The colors have to be subdued. It does not have to be lavish. And in a way, you know, the point that Professor Condren said about conspicuous consumption, I would say the image of men, the charisma, this over-the-top image of male politicians is something which is up for consumption in India right now, very much, you know, in this renewed nationalist discourse that we are seeing here. Whereas women are relegated again to this privatized domain, and they are expected to don certain kind of colors and certain kind of outfits. So there's a definite desexualization and deglamorization of women. And just to bring out an example, if one chooses to dress differently, let's say in a quote unquote glamorous way, then they would be touted as immoral or diverting from the norm. So there are these two young actress turned MPs from Bengal who joined the parliament recently in 2019, and they dressed in Western formals on the day of the opening of the parliament, the session. And of course, there was a lot of trolling against them in the media and social media, that how can they wear Western clothes? They are not on screens. They are not actresses. They are parliamentarians, and they should not wear these kind of clothes. So, you know, this is pretty common. And this also suggests that women can't really choose what they want to wear, perhaps, whereas men can. And a certain kind of authority, a certain kind of image becomes very important for male politicians, whereas women politicians have to sort of invisibilize their bodies and their sexualities in order to be in the public domain. So the body has to be left in the private domain. Whereas for a male politician, the body becomes hyper-visible, which I find, you know, which is an antagonism which exists.
Can I just add to that in fact there have been women politicians who have directly challenged this entire thing in India. I'm thinking specifically of Mayawati, who was challenged because she, being a representative of the Dalits and so on and so forth, wore a lot of gold, wore silk, salwar kameez and so on and so forth, started using makeup as was reported, in sharp contrast to her mentor, Kanchi Ram, who always dressed like a clerk, you know, in his trousers and his shirt outside his trousers. So I think that, you know, we need to also give women politicians greater credit for the way in which they use these for their own specific ends. And in India, I think it has a great deal to do with class and caste. If you think of the most famous female politician we've ever had in this country, Indira Gandhi, she dressed as she was an extremely educated elite person. She would never be seen with a hair out of place. In fact, that little gray streak of hers, there was a great deal of speculation when we were children as to whether it was natural or how often did she have to go to a hairdresser. So, and if you look at the other extremely successful elite politician, who is Jayalalitha of Tamil Nadu, who also makes it a point to appear absolutely perfectly made up, or made it a point to appear perfectly made up. Even when she was putting on weight and so on and so forth, she was extraordinarily fashionable. And both of these women, Indira Gandhi and Jayalalitha, made it a point to speak in the kind of English that we are using now, especially in international fora. And that was part of their appeal, that Indira Gandhi can represent India anywhere, and match wits with the best of the Western politicians who are there. I remember that famous embrace by Fidel Castro, and the fantastic response, which we all applauded when she was asked which way did India lean, towards the USSR or the US, and she said, no, we stand upright in the United Nations. Great moment of pride. And she said it as a woman wearing a sari, extremely fashionable, sophisticated lady that she was. Mayawati, on the other hand, her clothes, and maybe Garima will be able to shed more light on it, because I think you come from a place where it's the royal blood of the female politicians which is more important. So, if you're aristocracy, the Rajmatas and so on and so forth. So the point I'm trying to make is that, I fear, and, pardon me again, only male taking part in this discussion, that maybe we are making women far too much of a victim. I think women in politics have shown an uncanny ability to use things for their own ends. And when Angela Merkel was being discussed, I thought of the other great European politician, great not in the sense of the good that she did, Margaret Thatcher, who also comes from a science background. She has a PhD in science, like Angela Merkel. She doesn't come from a particularly wealthy class, but if you look at the way in which they dress, and we grew up listening to the fact. I was in England in '77 when she got elected, pretty young, and she was often called the only man in the cabinet and so on and so forth. And yet she was extremely quote unquote feminine. She would get her hair made, and she had her handbags and her designer dresses and so on and so forth. So I'm saying that Margaret Thatcher, operating in the 70s and the 80s, and Angela Merkel operating in the 21st century, she's from East Germany, they are also using the semiotics of politics for their own advantage. Our present chief minister is doing exactly the same thing. She comes across as this kind of every woman, almost desexualized, and it's no coincidence that she has chosen a color scheme and a style of wearing a sari which is familiar to every Calcuttan because of Mother Teresa. Not a person I like, but that's not to be discussed here. Mamata, and I received a great deal of flack when a couple of months back I wrote in an article in Outlook that Bengal, for all its claims to being secular and above caste, I just wondered if Mamata would have had as much success if she wasn't a Brahmin. And so many people said, why did you have to say this? Come on, this is not right, and so on and so forth. So I'm saying, let's also give women politicians credit for the sort of things that they have done, despite the fact that politics remains a grossly patriarchal, incredibly violent space, at least in India. Thank you.
Can I say one more? Sorry.
Yes. Thank you.
I just really like to respond to that, if you don't mind. But I think that's a really important point, is that this idea of women being victims in a variety of different circumstances. We have to kind of move beyond that. Actually, that we have to actually really take into account the diverse ways in which women exert agency. I mean, interesting when you talk about Margaret Thatcher, as somebody who was brought up under Margaret Thatcher. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be a fan, but I do get your point. I mean, she was in a completely male-dominated Westminster. She was the only woman, and in a way, you can say, well, was that the only way that she could do it at the time? And she worked that very well, and managed to, to continue her terms. But I also think this idea of networking is important. Women actually tend to be quite good at using different forms of networking to exert their voice. And I know that it was mentioned earlier around male networks that can be quite closed, which is absolutely, I think a very important point. But the women also use networking to gain voice into what are often very masculine spheres. If we take, for example, the Northern Irish Women's Coalition here, who were successful in gaining a voice at the negotiating table during the Good Friday negotiations, the reason that they managed to do that was by crossing communal divides or sectarian divides and mobilizing, although the women didn't necessarily agree on all of these points, but they managed to mobilize as a cross-community party, and they were the only party that managed to be the only cross-community party that were in the negotiations. And that's kind of the ability to be able to network was fundamental in them being able to be elected, to get enough votes to actually participate in the negotiations. And I think that you find that in various places in the world. And if I go back to the case of Nepal, for example, where after the signing of the peace agreement, and that when the Maoist government was elected in 2008, there was a very successful women's caucus in the early stages, which crossed party lines and actually managed to get very important issues on gender inequality get brought into the discussions, particularly in places where where there was closed committees, which tended to be populated by men, but of course, then they were prevented from continuing this caucus, which was very detrimental in order to be able to mobilize on specific issues, particularly around. So, for example, in the new constitution, there's the gender inequality, which is in the citizenship laws, the citizenship clauses, for example, but there has also been mobilized networking outside of government between previously elected members of this constituent assembly, who are managed to channel their voices through those that are within the constituent assembly, but that networking is taking place outside of government. So I think there's these really innovative ways that women actually use networking to be able to channel their voice and channel opinions on particular issues, and which is often overlooked. So I just wanted to mention that at that point. So.
Thank you so much. I would ask my colleague Srinvanti to take up the further questions now. Srinvanti, if you could go ahead.
Thank you, Shajoni, for that. So now I would just like to, take the discussion towards a slightly different angle, and would like to put forward the next question. So the question is, like, time and again, we have always come across something which talks, kind of throws light on the very fact that there has always been sexual violence, abuse, and these kind of incidents against women in terms of conflicts and like peace processes. And yet this very idea that how violence against women has always been a very intrinsic part of peace processes, conflicts, and crisis situations. Despite this has always remained a very under-discussed, under-researched, and quite like an avoided area. So I would just like to request the esteemed panelists to shed light on this idea. Thank you. Over to the panel.
Well, I maybe address that again from a psychoanalytic point of view. Sigmund Freud wrote a very important paper when he was replying to Albert Einstein. And Einstein said to him at the outbreak of the Second World War, can you explain, Professor Freud, why it is that we have come so far, we have been, developed ethically and morally and whatever, and yet, war is about to break out again. And Freud responded, well, we've never, it's not that we have stooped so low, but that actually we've never developed our moral and ethical stance when it comes to the question of war. And there are very many other points that he makes there. But the point he went on to make was that civilization is a very thin veneer. It barely covers, the actual, the reality, and that our moral development is in fact very, very low. And so that when periodically we have to lift the lid, we have to, the lid is taken off the culture, and people have to let all of their natural instincts, this is what Freud said, it's not what I necessarily said, they have to let their natural instincts run riot. And one of the natural instincts then is to, according to Freud, would be basically to suppress women. So the violence that takes place against women is in another way, the envy of women running riot completely. And in other theorists call it a festival. People like Georges Bataille or what's his name, Roger Calwa would talk about war as a festival, when all of the prohibitions that traditionally keep civilization in place are lifted, and things can run riot. And then a little bit like the religious festivals like Christmas or whatever, at the end of the festival, when people have been exhausted, they're all delighted to go back to civilization as we know it. So, women who take part in war, for instance, they sometimes take part in war as they did in Ireland, in order to be considered equal people, equal citizens. As soon as the war is over, they're put back into the closet. So the public and the private sphere are again, radically dissected. So the violence the gendered violence that does take place in war is simply the emotional or the sexual underpinning of the culture as we know it. It's simply an expression of it, which is allowed to rise at a time of the festival, and then be put back, back into a more private space when the war is over. The problem is that war is a culture, violence is a culture, and the culture of violence is the grammar of human relationships in most of our so-called civilized societies up to today. That's very pessimistic, but I think it's also true, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Condren. I would just like to request the other panelists to speak a few words about this if they would like to.
Professor Riley, do you want to speak?
I'm happy to speak, but I'm conscious that I kind of had an extra bit of speaking in the last one. So do go ahead and I'll follow you.
Okay, so I wanted to take this question of, women, sexual violence against women in the context of conflict to the historical construction of Indian nation and during the anti-colonial struggle, and how the boundaries of the nation, the identity of the nation was sort of transposed onto the bodies of women. So women were hailed as the representative of Mother India in need of protection, and of course relegated to the private space, which was also seen as a political scientist, Partha Chatterjee has pointed out, it was also seen as the space of culture, the space of purity on which the nation had to build itself. So any onslaught on that space would be considered, or any onslaught on women's body was considered as an onslaught on the nation. So the first formative period of this association of women with territory would come, in Indian context at least, from the time of nationalism, the creation of national identity. And this, of course, finds its expression in 1947 when India, the British India went through partition and the two nations were created on the basis of religion, and how in the conflict, the communal conflict that ensued, that followed, women's bodies again became targets or territories on which a community's honor was marked. And this is something, so I want to take off from that historical moment and now come to the present moment, where we again see a conflict. But as has already been pointed out, a war is, or militarization of society is a cultural phenomenon too. And it seeps down to our everyday lives. So there's a way in which otherization of communities and solidification of certain identities, especially religious identities, is taking place in India in the contemporary period. And what are its implications on women's bodies and violence against women? And I presume, and I'm afraid that it has already, the cycle of violence against women has already started, as repositories of particular religious communities' honor, and how a kind of low intensity conflict which is going on in India in terms of, in the name of community, in the name of religion, could perhaps find its expression in terms of violence, increased instance of violence against women. And I would bring the point that was earlier raised in the panel on intersectionality and the way in which religious identity and gender identity comes together here in order to make certain kinds of women belonging to certain religion, let's say a Muslim woman in India right now, doubly vulnerable to onslaughts and to violence, I would say.
And maybe I'll continue from there, but yeah, I mean some of the points that you raised there kind of feed into, I suppose, some of the points I was going to raise around this idea of the continuum of violence. And so if we look at sexual violence in conflict, for example, it's often seen as something extraordinary and during this time of conflict. But the reality is that we have to be looking at actually the root causes of that as coming from a long time before the conflict starts. So in looking at that gender imbalance in times of peace or prior to conflict, that influences how women's bodies are perceived during conflict. So I suppose feeding on from previous points is that women are often seen as the kind of center of the community. And so therefore, in order to target a woman by dehumanizing through rape or sexual violence is a way of targeting the whole community. And you find that in multiple conflicts. We take, for example, the conflict in Guatemala, where peasant communities were the primary targets by the state. A lot of the very wide-scale rape and sexual violence took place within kind of what was seen as rebel villages. So where women were raped as a punishment for the whole village, you can look at this from the perspective of actually if you dehumanize or sexually violate women who are perceived as belonging to the men of the village, then you harm the whole community. So it's these underlying assumptions of what being a woman means in terms of maintaining masculine power and how that then is realized during conflict. And I think it also feeds into sexual violence against men during conflict, this idea of feminizing the man from the other community, the enemy man. So where a man is raped, they're dehumanized, they're sexualized in the sense they're feminized, and therefore it's a particularly harmful way of targeting that community. But also this idea of the continuum of violence stems from ideas of masculinity. So where masculinity is seen as the most powerful, men are seen as the most powerful being masculine, when we have sort of idealized traits of what it means to be a man. So the stereotypical idea of the warrior, the protector, the brave hero, those notions become exacerbated in times of conflict, which often leads to higher levels of sexual violence against women during periods of conflict. But at the same time, we have to realize that women also participate in armed groups. That women in conflict are not only the victims, but they're also participants or agents to violence. And although a much greater minority, women have been involved in the perpetration of sexual violence in conflict, or as kind of the inciters. Particularly for example, there are a few examples that I could draw on in Rwanda, for example. But this is often interlinked with issues of ethnicity and identity. So it's around the targeting. The gendered targeting of those individuals from the other community. I'll maybe stop there, and I can certainly come back to this topic, but I realize we're getting short of time there, so I'll pass on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Riley and Dr. Condren and Dr. Dhabhai, for the wonderful insights. I would now like to request Dr. Das to share his views on this. So please, over to you.
I'll be very brief. Taking up from what Heidi said, if you look at our neighboring country of Bangladesh, the two most important political figures there are both women, Hasina Wajid and Khaleda Zia. And one of them, at least, is leading a party and standing for policies which are violently anti-women, and which want to bring back quote-unquote traditional Islamic law and so on and so forth, and supported by the most, regressive mullahs you can find virtually anywhere, fanatics and so on and so forth. So this is problematic. I mean, I think this entire business of trying to generalize about women in politics, which I've tried to say, is problematic. However, I think that politics as it is practiced now, going back to something that was said right at the beginning by all three speakers, is so concerned with matters of the outside and of the public, that women who step into politics for whatever reasons, could be family, could be because they're ambitious, intelligent, could be because they have a real desire to serve their country or their community, unfortunately have to abandon these other notions. If you look at the debates in India around things like resettlement, it's always politicians keep talking about the monetized value of what people are losing. So, if you lose your land or your village, how much should you be paid by way of compensation? And the people who are usually talking about other things, less tangibly monetizable things, are women. If you look at various debates, and just one further example, not from politics in the sort of party political sense in which we've been discussing it, but back in the early 21st century, when I was part of a group that was looking at primary education in Bengal, and we done by the Pratichi Trust, set up by Amartya Sen and so on and so forth, we suggested that instead of parent-teacher committees in primary school, there should be mother-teacher committees, because it is usually the mother who has to take the responsibility of arranging things and so on and so forth. And some school districts actually did this, including Birbhum, where I was at that time. And the difference was instantaneous. There would be many more parents, in this case the mothers, turning up for meetings. They would try to make themselves heard, and so this sort of movement from the inner world of the home and raising children to the outer world where they are getting educated. Fathers, again, I'm generalizing. I'm sure there are good fathers there as well, and the fathers who are not regular at parent-teacher meetings were not necessarily bad fathers, but you see this kind of thing. And I think if we try to bring this into our larger political discourse, which unfortunately is missing amongst all major political parties in India, if we try to bring this into our political discourse, then we might be able to move away from these binaries of masculine, feminine, private, public, and so on and so forth, and just recognize that women politicians are individuals who are having to battle sometimes a great many disadvantages because of their gender, because of their caste, because of their class, because of their looks, much more than men, the color of their skins, which Srijani mentioned in passing, but I thought that was a very important point. If you're fair complexion in India, you stand a better chance of being accepted as a leader. So I think the conversation has to change, I think, in significant ways. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das. I would like to request Srijoni to take over from here with the further questions, but I think she's having a technical problem. Are you there, Srijoni?
Yeah, I'm there. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Okay, so I have another question. This question has come up from the audience. So the question is open for the entire panel. It's always been a struggle for women in every domain, give it political, social, cultural, in terms of personal or individual.
I think is it always going to be a struggle in all caps it ends, right? That's the question. Yeah.
I'm happy to start. I'm conscious that I keep jumping in, but I'm happy to start if that's useful.
No, ma'am. Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just say quickly, and I think that there's an important point that Dr. Das made earlier around the kind of the normalization of having people in having women in the public sphere. Now, I think I can't really answer the question of whether it's always going to be a struggle. I hope not. But the more that women are normalized being in positions of public positions, and we can see that very much at what Dr. Das was talking about at the local level, where if I understood right, you were talking about at the local reservations that came in 73, and how that has actually had an impact in bringing of visualizing or normalizing the women in local governance. And I think that this has to take place both at the local and at the national level, and in all spheres of life, in the public, in the private sphere, also where we have, the majority of, CEOs of private companies are men. This has started to change. There is change in these areas, but we have to. I refer to Pierre Bardot's concept of habitus. So the idea that we have to have a shift in habitus, so we're shifting the way that we think about that politics is generally a masculine sphere. In order to do that, we have to have women, all sorts of women, in those spaces that were previously masculinized. And that's why I think reservations or quotas are particularly important in order to shift and also to send that message to younger women, the importance of role models for younger women coming in, who are educated, who are coming from a variety of different backgrounds, that it's actually completely normal to have women in positions of power, and that has to shift in order for that struggle to be changing that struggle. And just one more point I say is that one of the problems is that often when women get into positions of power, they do that, but at the same time have to do what is expected in the domestic sphere. So it's all very well to be celebrating women's elections when women are elected into local governments or national governments, but you actually have to think about what's going on at home as well, and that often there's an expectation that those women will do these public roles but also have to deal with what is happening at the private level, and that involves men in this discussion. Gender is a relational concept. It's not only about women, and I think that's quite problematic sometimes, is that we only associate gender with women, whereas gender is about the relationship between masculinity and femininity. So therefore we have to include men in that conversation. And we have to remember that there are also a lot of men that are supportive of shifting gender inequalities as well. So we have to, maybe shift that conversation a little bit beyond that it's only about women.
Thank you so much, Dr. Riley, for your words and your insights. I would like to request the other panelists if they would like to share their views on this.
I'd be happy to speak about this a little bit because the War of Independence, or the Civil War in Ireland, took place in the early 20th century. And there were two women who were involved in that. One of them was called Constance Markievicz, and she was part of the revolutionary struggle. And she is depicted in statues and in many other representations in full military regalia, carrying a machine gun. So she has become an icon of, you know, what some people would consider to be feminist liberation. I actually don't. Now, she had a sister, and her sister was called Eva Gore Booth. In fact, she had two sisters. But Eva Gore Booth, and they both came from a landed family in Ireland, but Eva went to England. She had been involved in the Land League Wars, but then went to England and worked on behalf of prostitutes and flower sellers and the poor and the deprived in England. And she wrote an extraordinary number of pamphlets and plays, and one book in particular called The Social and Psychological Analysis of St. John's Gospel. Now, I happened to come across that when I was teaching in the institute that I direct called Women's Spirit Ireland, because I was looking to see if there was a woman speaking about theology in the early 100s. And I was absolutely shocked to find that her work had actually anticipated a great deal of the feminist critique of theology that didn't really begin in the second wave until the late 1960s and early 70s. Nobody knew anything about Eva Gore Booth. She had disappeared from history. I wrote about her in the Field Day Anthology of Irish Women's Writing, and since then, several books have come out about her, and more recently, the Department of Foreign Affairs commissioned a series of artists to compile pictures and portraits, which are now being sent around the world through the Department of Foreign Affairs. So yes, and the other thing is, yesterday I was speaking with somebody who has been involved in Irish publishing, and a very well-known woman in Ireland is currently dying. And her, you know, as she is leaving this world, her concern is that even the feminist movement of the 1970s and 80s is now being written out of history by, or her story, by a new generation of young women who are, to be blunt about it, cutting their teeth by ignoring or not recognizing the work of women in the 70s and 80s. That's you know, a particularly difficult issue, which I won't say anything more about it. But I just want to say, you know, that my concern about women in politics is not so much that women go for a kind of a Me Too school of feminism and join the system as it is. I'm much more concerned with a movement that was initiated by a woman called Sarah Ruddick, a book she wrote in the 70s and 80s called Maternal Thinking. And, you know, to be very brief about it, her position was that, you know, if there were 12 people around a table, we would never say, well, these 3 people can have, you know, all the food and the rest of you can have water and rice. And she said, that's exactly what we are doing at an international level. And even at a national level, the ethics of the private sphere bear little or no relationship to what's happening in the public sphere. And so at the moment, the GDP of many European countries derives from the sale and the manufacture of armaments. And those armaments are being distributed all around the world, causing violence and national struggles, whereas Europe can now say, oh, you know, we haven't had a war in 50 years. The wars are all being fought abroad. You know, the goddess Athena at the end of the Orestian trilogy, she said, you know, let's put an end to war in Greece. Civil war, you know, we can't have people fighting one another. She said, let all our wars be fought abroad. And so, in other words, the peace of Europe could be said to be bought at the expense of so-called underdeveloped countries around the rest of the world. So my concern about women in politics is to break down that division between the ethics of the private sphere, the kind of parental values that we all hold when we are dealing with our nearest and dearest, and the breakdown of those values when it comes to the distribution of the goods of this world and the wealth of this world and the resources of this world, which operates to an entirely different system of ethics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Condren. I would just like to ask Dr. Das and Dr. Dhabhai if they would like to speak a few words about this.
Okay, I could take it up first.
Sure, ma'am.
So, I think, to respond to this question, I would like to go back to one of the points that I raised initially in terms of what is the nature, or where do we really want women when we think of women in political power? Do we think of them in institutional spaces, or do we also want to create access of women to power in informal spaces? Because a lot of politics in contexts of global south especially happen in the informal spaces, outside of the institutions. But to my mind, and this is a struggle that one faces when one is in any position, forget about just political power, but even in academic spaces, in university spaces, which are also institutions, where also women have to negotiate on a day-to-day basis several levels of power and create their own space. So, I would sort of anthropologize this question a little bit, and I would think of the ways in which everyday struggles for power take place, and then what is the way out, perhaps, if that's the spirit of the question, that where do we go from here, what is the way out? It's a difficult thing to suggest. There's no one prescription as a way out of this conundrum that we are in, but I would suggest, just as a beginning, and it's a very tentative thought, that institutional spaces, if we could strengthen, so changing the discourse, social discourse, and changing the terms and conditions on which gender relations get played out in a society. And there are so many, identities which are at play, which have already been talked about, is a very, very long-term and difficult proposition, and one has to always work towards it. And many of us are working towards it in various, through various channels, whether it's through feminist movements out on the streets, or through more institutional channels. And for me right now, I think what is a struggle is to make or create sensitive institutions themselves. It can start from the classroom, it could start from an office space and the workspace as a whole. And in India, the workspace has, of course, been fraught with a lot of controversy, and there have been guidelines against sexual harassment in workspace and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do we make the workspace sensitive for women to take a step towards assumption of certain kind of authority or certain kind of power? And right now, the only short-term sort of, perhaps one can call it solution to my mind, is to strengthen these institutions, and there women who are already part of these institutions have to play a greater role, have to not just, assume the idioms and language of power that has been there always, that has been normalized, which is a more masculine way of being in an institution, but to create a different kind of regime, a different language of perhaps power in these institutions. For instance, let me again go back to examples from Indian politics, that many a times when women assume a political office, they remain formal figureheads, because a lot of these institutional spaces have been devoid of any real power, because real power many a times lies in the informal conversational networks. It lies sometimes in the street corner informal conversations that happen between people, rather than in spaces of the office. And many a times women rely on the official spaces because that's the only access they have. They have not been part of many a times because historically they have been excluded from the public spaces. And so it is not always comfortable to go and join a particular, let's say, adda outside in the public space, let's say a tea shop. There could be various barriers to that. So the only access that women have many a times in spaces and institutional spaces is the formal, rule-oriented space. And those spaces many a times are delegitimized. Even bodies that deal with sexual harassment, sometimes I've seen delegitimize the very idea of gender justice. So, it's very important for us, I think, as a first step to strengthen the institution itself, to then talk about these informal spaces and try to sensitize them. And to make sure that institutions have, the space to discuss issues, which I think right now we lack.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dhabhai. It was brilliant. I would just like to request Dr. Das if he would like to speak a few words on this.
I'll just literally a few words. I think I agree with what everyone has said, especially Garima, but this is something that I was discussing with Srijoni earlier. Given that in the private space, men are so grossly pampered, corseted, privileged, how is this transition going to take place? I mean, I think that every man is a potential rapist. Every man is capable of violence, but the places in which they manifest themselves are because of structural problems. And I come back to that link between the public and the private. If you grow up as a young boy, as a baby, male baby, being privileged over your sisters, your cousins, even sometimes your mother. So you grow up with this almost monstrous sense of entitlement. And it takes a great deal of unlearning to try and get rid of at least some of those characteristics. Speaking for myself, I have tried. I don't know how far I've succeeded. I suspect not well enough. Because the way I look and so on and so forth, I'm naturally pushed to make decisions in an institutional space, including in situations in which right now, for example, there are more women around the table, and then people will turn to me, and if I find that old Adam in me sort of coming out, that privileged male who's being asked to decide. This can be terrifying for a man, but if you kind of express that terrifiedness, you become less of a man. How do we deal with this? I agree with Garima that we need to change these institutional spaces, and she and I happen to be working in two of the most, I think, gender neutral or at least friendly spaces where a lot of our female students, I don't think there's any female student either in Presidency University or in Jadavpur who would be ashamed of speaking up or hesitant about speaking up. But I've spoken to so many of them, and they say it just changes the moment you leave the gates of the university. You enter a space where you're immediately suspected. But I'm saying even within the university, even within these democratic, gender-sensitive spaces, including in places like the women's studies departments and in committees which look at gender harassment or even ragging and so on and so forth, there is this imbalance of power. And as a man, I think one of the things that I have to constantly keep doing, and I'm sure I fail in it very often, is to keep reminding myself of my privilege and to not speak first or jump in and say things and so on and so forth, because that's what I'm kind of encouraged to do. That monstrous privileging of the male in the home has to stop, and it has to begin at the home. Without that, we are not going to be able to change institutions. And I'm not even talking about the kind of public spaces that Garima mentioned, the tea shops, the addas, the gatherings of men. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das. Now, I believe we are kind of moving towards the end of our panel discussion. And I would just like to put forward another question. So it goes like this. Is there any way by which religion and myth play a role in promoting internalized oppression and horizontal violence among women? So that's the question, and over to the panel now. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's absolutely essential, because the symbolic capital of every society is, and particularly in the main monotheistic religions, is male-centered. And one of the things that I work on extensively is the whole concept of sacrifice. And because it's one of those issues that's hardly ever mentioned, but it's common to the three main monotheistic religions, that the sacrifice of the founder, whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or the attempted sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, is the foundational myth, or the foundational story of those societies. And I think it's particularly unfortunate. And my own background would be from the Christian world, is that the life of Jesus, for instance, who was gentle and responsible toward the poor and honored women, and destroyed kicked out the priests out of the temple when they were exchanging money and whatever. When we talk about the theology and the philosophies based on Christianity, they are based on sacrifice. They are based on the manner of his death and not the manner of his life. And that's why the prophets of all the major religions said, take the stinking smell of your sacrifices out of my nose. Have you not realized that I desire mercy, not sacrifice? And there's a question there in relation to psychoanalysis I see on the chat line, asking about my comments on Freud. One of the psychoanalysts whose work that I follow these days is a woman called Bracha Lichtenberg-Ettinger. And she's a Jewish psychoanalyst. She's also an artist and a feminist theorist. But she is also developing the whole concept of mercy, and trying to, as I am also doing through my work on Bridget, trying to recuperate the notion of mercy, which basically translates as womb love, or the love of the beginning, the love of the origins, which is primarily matrixial, but which extends out from the values, as I said earlier, the parental values of nurture against those of the values of history. And just in relation to the question on the chat line, the other French because they asked about French psychoanalysis, the other French psychoanalyst whom I follow is a woman called Luce Irigaray. And she asked very poignantly, she said, Hegel, she critiques Hegel and Freud and Plato and all of the mainstream thinkers, but she asked very succinctly, who are the gods of history? Where are their altars? Where do they live? And what about the gods of nature? Those who, and at a time when we're experiencing climate change and we're experiencing those pandemics, the whole question of worldview needs to be radically challenged, given the kind of world that we are now inheriting and passing on to future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Condren. I would like to request the other esteemed panelists to speak a few words about this. And yeah.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute. So I'll just say very, very quickly, I suppose. I mean, one of the problems, I suppose, is that the way that religion has been manipulated in varying forms across the centuries has often kind of steered it towards a very masculine orientation. I mean, even if we often see Islam is often seen as a very kind of masculine religion, but actually, if you look at the kind of the foundations of what Islam was built upon, it's much more based on social justice than what it's often perceived as. But so you have to look at how that has been, in a sense, manipulated over the years with the rewriting of text by in the sort of 10th and 11th century of the kind of the male leaders of the time. And I mean, I'm not an expert on religion, but I think that this is the way that it's been kind of very much monopolized over the years. It's the same with, for example, with Hinduism. As if we look at the way that the kind of the Brahmin masculinization of what we understand as the kind of dominant force in Hinduism, and the kind of impurity of women, and actually overlooks some of the kind of, the symbols of the woman in Hinduism, for example, the goddess Durga, who was very, very powerful and whatever. So it's this kind of orientation of the kind of how that has been manipulated over the years, and it's been instilled at a societal level, is hugely influential in women's daily life, in the gender dynamics of society, what we symbolize as the normal, and it's important that the kind of origins of these masculine orientation of religion is also becomes part of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Riley. Over to Dr. Das and Dr. Dhabhai.
Maybe Dr. Das could take this up first. I'm just making some notes here.
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah, fine. I agree with everything that's been said, and I just want to make the most obvious distinction between religion as text and dogma and religion as a lived religion. And it's interesting that within that huge grab bag called Hinduism, which isn't a religion at all to begin with, it is usually being the contesting the esoteric, which has foregrounded certain notions of feminine power. In most Brahminical Hindu religions, for example, the menstruating woman is taboo. But within Tantric Hinduism or certain sects of Tantra, the menses, the menstrual blood is seen as sacred. And interestingly, if you look at the newest goddesses of Hinduism, I mean, unlike the Christians and so on, we have lots of gods and goddesses, and we keep getting new ones. I'm sure there's going to be a Corona goddess or god soon, if not there already. So the latest, the youngest of the gods and the god have both been goddesses. Three of them: Shitala, goddess of smallpox, a woman. The only goddess created by Hindi films, Santoshima, is also a woman. And a little earlier than Shitala, but is Bono Bibi, the goddess of the Sundarbans. So the last three goddesses that we've created here have been goddesses. Deities that we've created have been female. None of which is to say that religion has not been, in general, profoundly anti-women, even amongst the tantrics, whose notion of Dehotattva, which is too difficult for me to understand and go into here now, actually gives space for things like, as I said, menstrual blood, various excretions of the female body, which are typically excluded. Even there, if you look at most of the tantric texts, they're all written and controlled by men. Even the sects which still exist, which borrow from tantrism, are strongly masculinist, including the Bauls and the Pokis, these great, itinerant singers, minstrels. There too, there is this powerful masculinist urge. So religion has been bad for men in general, but I don't think we are in any position to get rid of it anytime soon, especially after this pandemic. I mean, people are turning towards their gods or goddesses in greater numbers than before. Right now, there's the big puja going on, not necessarily because of the Corona Shura, as the virus has been labeled, but to pray for, release from God's wrath or whatever fairly soon. We're not going to get out of religion. And I fear that what will happen, mentioning the last question asked by Nandini Gupta, I think that there will be a backlash against women. It has already started, and it will continue for the next, because women are going to be blamed for several of the ills. They already are being blamed, if not for the outbreak of the virus itself. And they will be disproportionately affected when it comes to incomes, when it comes to taking on more jobs, when it comes to more responsibilities, being made scapegoats. And men, millions and millions of men in the country, as they lose their jobs, as they are made redundant, are going to take out their frustrations on the women closest to them, their daughters, their wives, their siblings, and so on and so forth. Things actually do look dire. Like all pandemics, like all crises, this will have a negative effect on women. I fear all we can keep doing is to start, continue to speak and write and hope that things change for the better. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das. Over to you, Garima ma'am.
So I just have a brief intervention. I agree with whatever has already been said by the co-panelists. Just to add, religion, of course, has inherently been patriarchal in, I think, almost all societies. And in India, more so, we see the narratives of Hindu mythology, for instance, where women are shown in particular kind of positions of especially subordination, goddesses being subordinate to the gods, the male gods. And this is a cultural discourse that, of course, has found its way through Hindutva in contemporary India, and we read about it, and I think we all are sort of familiar with it, so I won't go into it. In terms of historiography as well, I would refer to this article by Uma Chakravarti, which I found pretty telling in this regard, where she criticizes the dominant paradigm of history writing in India and how that also, in a way, brings the dominant religious community in terms of thinking about ancient India, which is the Hindu paradigm. So Hindu historiography has been the dominant historiography, and in the Hindu historiography also, the title of her essay is Whatever Happened to the Vedic Dasi. So the Vedic period and the ancient treatises that were being read by historians like A.S. Altekar have been revisited by feminist scholars to rethink the position of women in religion, and also what was the position of women who were invisibilized in the dominant historiography, like the figure of the Vedic Dasi in Uma Chakrabarti's essay. But having said that, let me also go to a point which was raised by Professor Riley earlier in terms of alternative networks created by women, and to also think of women in some ways agentic rather than just victims of certain structures. And there's this interesting book that I read a few years back by Tarini Bedi, Dashing Ladies of Shiv Sena, where she mentions how women negotiate the space of the home and try to mobilize other women from the neighborhood and from their family through religious idioms. So religion has also become a kind of legitimizing device for a lot of women in India, for whom going to a temple every day, they don't have to really answer to their families where they are going, and they become alternative spaces for socialization. So women also sometimes use religion very smartly in order to go for long pilgrimages. In a way, what is otherwise considered to be a trait of a bad woman, like abandon your family and go for a long pilgrimage or a long holiday, would not be approved. But if you are going for a religious purpose, then it finds a lot of approval in society and in the family also. So I think it's very interesting how, though religion has excluded women, whether it's goddesses in mythology or whether it's the way in which religion and historiography is intertwined, but at the same time, religion has also, if I may use the term, provided a subversive site for a lot of women. Though it's also used by a lot of political parties for their informal networking, to garner more support from a lot of women, like Shiv Sena. The book by Bedi talks about that. So yeah, I think I would end there. Thank you.
Wow, that was very interesting, Garima ma'am. So with this, we kind of wrap up today's discussion. And before I request Srijani to do a formal closing kind of thing, I would just like to request the four of our esteemed panelists to speak a few words, like, as the closing remarks, what they felt about the discussion and any sort of closing remarks. So over to the panel. Yes, Dr. Riley, would you like to kind of go?
Okay, if that's, yeah, I just say a couple of points. I think that the issues that we've covered have been quite diverse. So we started with politics, and we moved to sexual violence in conflict, or violence against women in conflict, and then we moved to the issue of religion. And I think that we need to remember that these are all interlinked. You know, the lack of access to women in politics has we also had to consider how we understand politics. What is the public sphere? And this was discussed so succinctly earlier. When we look at politics, it's not just in the political sphere; it's on the you know, on the street corner, in other spaces as well. So we have to kind of rethink that. But the way that women are perceived in the various different spaces is often also related to society and assumptions, stereotypes, the way that we perceive what a woman should be, what a man should be, which is instilled from a very early age. And that is also interlinked with religion. And the way that that is realized in times of crisis is often a continuum of these inequalities or these assumptions, these stereotypes that already exist within society. So that this interlinking of all of these three topics, you know, there's not a disconnect between these topics, they're all interlinked.
Just to add on to that, I think we had a rich discussion which started, and I think we have sort of moved the terrain from institutional politics to begin with the parliament and the question of representation, formal representation, to the everyday politics of religion and representation, right? So I think it's something that also tells us a lot about how and where to find politics. And this is something where we begin a lot of our lectures, right, in political science, that whether we should think about women in political power only in terms of the chief ministers and prime ministers and others, which will actually not be a good scale to measure equity, and which will not be a good scale. It will actually mislead us to think about questions of gender equity. But we have to think about, you know, more intimate spaces like home, as Professor Das rightly pointed out, or the space of religion, or, as you know, we have been discussing, the streets or the public space, and the way in which public and private are many a times renegotiated by the ones who are powerful in society, so as to say, and by women in terms of subversion. So I think that's where the politics as a process and as a practice is something that I would say we should think about.
I just want to say thank you for a very rich discussion, and it's been a real pleasure and an honor to be included in this international discussion, particularly from the two colonized countries. I hope we might have more collaboration between India and Ireland in the future. And I just want to say, as a theologian, I agree with what has just been said. I think what we really need to focus on also from the point of view of religion are the political myths. You know, what are the political mythologies that are currently governing, and why are they, and usually in a hegemonic system, the underlying political mythology is hidden. It's never brought to light. And certainly after the Second World War, many of the critical theorists were, you know, asking the question, you know, what is the dominant political mythology? But that question doesn't seem to be raised anymore, except by people like Pierre Bourdieu or, you know, maybe Michel Foucault, but very seldom raised in the academy as a political issue. So I just want to say thank you all for organizing this event, and it's been a real honor and a pleasure to be part of it.
Yes, and I would like to say thank you. And this is my granddaughter who was very quiet all this while, but hi, Loki, say hi. Yeah, okay, fine. She can't resist, you know, photobombing me. So thank you. Thanks CRRSS, and I do hope we can do more of this later.
Yeah. I would like to take in from where Professor Das left. Is that I would like to, on behalf of the center, I would like to thank each and every one of the panelists, all the audience that could make it. Thank you for taking out time and being a part of our small initiative. We had a lovely discussion. I learned a lot personally from all of you, and I hope that, you know, in future also I could learn from each and every one of you. So thank you so much for being a part, and yes, I do hope that we could have future collaborations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.